Hello and welcome to your next tutorial in C#, and today we're going to be discussing classes and object-oriented programming. Now this is probably the biggest thing that you'll deal with if you're taking this as an introductory programming course or any level 1 course. This is going to be the biggest thing that you'll be dealing with, and it's very important that you grasp this concept because pretty much from here on out we're going to be using objects when it comes to actual programming, and you will use them in real life. So what are objects? Well, basically the best way you can look at them is an actual object in real life. And what objects have are characteristics or traits. Now every trait can't be described with the same data type. For an example, let's say in this example we're going to be calculating BMI. So we're going to have a name of our patient. So let's say we have a bunch of patients. So we have their name, we have their height, and their weight. And we're definitely going to need their height and weight in order to calculate their body mass index, or BMI, right? So yeah, these objects are going to contain all these different data types in addition to a bunch of functions or methods. They're called the same thing, functions and methods. I call them functions. That will do all this calculation for us, and it will all be in a separate file called a class. So let's first figure out how to create our class. So right click up here, click add, and go down to class. Sadly, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this all in one video, but it's probably better if I don't anyways, because it's a lot of stuff. So it's good to always call our class whatever represents whatever we're talking about, what kind of objects. So let's go BMI, since that's what its purpose is, and we'll click add. So now as you can see, we're now in a whole different file, bmi.c#. As you can see, it's over here too, and we can still go back to our form 1. There's our form 1 code and our form 1 designer. Let me move this over. There we go. Okay, so now we have our little class here. So let's go back to our form 1 designer first and double click our show button. So we're going to want to be able to create our own object, right? So first we're going to need to create our variables that we'll be using inside of our class, the name, height, and weight. So first we're going to have to fetch the name of our patient, so string name is equal to text name.text. As simple as that. We've done that plenty of times. Then next we're going to need their height. Let's say that's an integer, int height equals, and we'll have to use the convert dot to int, and text height dot text. There we go. And then the last variable we'll need is their weight. Let's say that's a double, just so we have 3 different data types we're working with here. And we'll call that text weight.text, and there we go. So now we have our 3 variables. Now, when we're dealing with these variables inside of our class, there's a certain term that you'll hear often in object-oriented programming, and that's called encapsulation. And basically, that's keeping the information that's being processed there, or basically, it's you keeping as many functions in there and all the data types you're using in there private, so that they cannot be seen in any other classes that you make, in any other forms, which are classes, or any other namespaces. So no other namespace will be able to read that information, so that they can't be tampered with by anywhere else in your application. You want to keep it safe. So that's encapsulation. So let's go into our bmi.c# little thing here, and at the bottom of the class is where we usually typically create our what are called member variables. And these variables are basically copies of these variables that we'll be using. So we have their name, height, and weight. We're going to want to declare them inside of our class as well, but we'll give them different names. So first, we're going to use the private keyword first, because that's where encapsulation comes into play. And let's call it string new name. Sorry if I misspell any of this. So we have new name. Then we'll have private int new height, and private double new weight. So basically these are the 3 same pieces of information that we're going to be throwing into our class and using as. So now we have our member variables. So can we create our object yet? No, we can't create our object yet because we don't have any functions in here. We need something to process this data. So the very first piece of information, the very first function that we create in here is called the default constructor. Even though the default constructor is not always necessary, it's very important that you always have it inside your class at the very top. Or it doesn't have to be at the top, but that's where it's convenient to place it. And what the constructor does, what the default constructor does, is it doesn't process these three variables right here that we created. Instead, it'll declare these three member variables that we created in this class to their null values. And you'll see what I mean. So in order to create a constructor, all you have to do is type in COT, or what was it? CTOR. Click tab and then tab again, and there you go. And you'll notice that the constructor is the same name as our class, and it has to be. And even though we won't be returning any values, for some reason if I throw void in there, I end up getting an error during runtime. So don't put void there. I don't quite understand why we can't do that, but so basically it's just public and then the name of the same name as the class. So this is our constructor. So we're going to set new name equal to an empty string, new height equal to 0, and new weight equal to 0 as well. But because new weight is a double, make sure you put 0.0 so that when any calculations are done, it'll be recognized as a double. So this is our default constructor. So not too useful, right? Because we can't actually use any of the information that we put inside of our text boxes because they're put here, and when we click our button show, we're not even using them. So what you could do is use what's called an overloaded constructor. So let me type that in. And there will be advantages of using this, and I'll show you when you'll use a default later, because this is so much, excuse me, that's my chocolate milk there. Too much of this stuff is being used at once. So you could use the CTOR again, but I'll just type it in manually. Public BMI. And okay, so notice here that the BMI here, where we would typically get an error here because these are the same name. So in order to avoid getting any errors here, we're going to have to pass in some parameters here. Now what parameters would we pass in here? Well, these three pieces of information, of course. Well, not these three. We're gonna pass in these three, even though they're the same thing, really. So we're gonna have string name, int height, and double weight. And then basically we're going to be passing in those three pieces of information that we got from our text box here. So these three pieces of information will be passed in as a parameter into our overloaded constructor, and what it will do is set our member variables equal to whatever we typed into our text boxes, these three. So we'll put new name equal to name, then new height equal to height, and new weight equal to weight. There we go. And the reason why you might be wondering why we're doing this is this is where encapsulation comes into play. We can't just access these variables by themselves, or we can't just use these variables that we pass in, because we don't want them to be tampered with later when we're, if we're using these in calculations, for an example. So, okay, so now we have our overloaded constructor. So basically the difference between the default and the overloaded is that all the default will do is set our member variables equal to their null states, and our overloaded constructor will set our variables, or will pass in what we typed into the text boxes and set our member variables equal to those values that we typed in the text box. So I guess we could create our object now, even though we can't actually use these functions yet, and we'll see why in a moment. So going to our form1.c#, okay, so there we go, we have name, height, and weight equal to those text boxes. So now let's actually create our first object. So in order to create our object, we first type in not a data type, but actually the name of the class. So the name of the class is BMI. Then after that, we can type in whatever we want to call that object. If we were doing students, for an example, we could just throw in like a student's name, like my name, Adam. But let's just go patient1. Patient1. There we go. And then set that equal to. Then since we're instantiating a new object here, we're going to use the new keyword and then type in BMI again. Now, since we typed in new BMI with these empty parameters, what's going to happen is it's going to automatically use the default constructor right here. This will automatically use the default constructor right here. So notice that going right here, since we said new BMI, it's going to access our default constructor and just set all our member variables to null. Now, could we just, whoops, right here. Now, could we just do this? Right below it, could we type in patient 1 and then, oh, whoops. Sorry about that. So could we just type in patient 1 and then pass in, let's say, our 3 pieces of information? Name, height, and weight? Nope. Patient 1 is a variable being used like a method. Well, apparently we can't use our overloaded constructor that way. So how do we use our overloaded constructor? Well, what you do is, and in case you want to use your overload constructor, is to actually throw in your 3 pieces of information in here instead, not just go patient 1 in parentheses, because that's not gonna, that doesn't exist. So we'll just throw in name, height, and weight this way. So doing that, now we'll actually be passing in our 3 pieces of information from our text boxes into this new object that we created, so into the class. So then it'll read this default constructor and be like, wait a minute, this has no parameters. You pass in 3, so we can't be using this constructor, so we're going to go to our overloaded constructor again, and each of these 3 will be equal to whatever we passed in. Then our member variables will be equal to these. Will be equal to whatever we passed in. But that's not really good enough. We're now setting our member variables equal to something, but what if we want to actually get that information? Okay, so this is about the end of the part 1 of this video, so I would like to continue on to the next video in which we learn about accessor functions and mutator functions. So I see you in part 2.